Debt is heavy like grief. Death is light like a feather. Now, when we talk about Japan's participation in World War II, almost everybody remembers immediately the kamikaze pilots that aimed their planes at the Allies' ships. But the truth is both more complex and tragic. In the last few years of World War II, Japan was not doing well. Their armed forces were inferior to the Allies, their air force wasn't as strong as it was before, and the Japanese had lost many experienced pilots during the war. The government understood the combination of better training and financing for the American pilots, as well as the better planes used by the Allies, made it impossible for the Japanese Empire to keep up with their enemies. The appearance of a substantial imbalance in the Allies' favor was felt fast, and Japanese soldiers started losing one battle after another. The military leadership started increasing their amount of recruiters who would call even university students to war, who were previously exempt from service, which wasn't enough anymore. In the fall of 1943, discussion on creating new tactics began. But when Japan couldn't stop the Allies' soldiers' march across the Pacific in 1944, the Imperial forces needed to do something. That's when the Special Attack Units appeared. They were subdivisions created to fulfill goals designed for suicide soldiers, which clearly demonstrated how hopeless the situation was. The Japanese military concentrated on the last effective measure of defense against the Allied forces that they used until the end of the war. Now, kamikaze pilots became one of the most recognizable subdivisions of the Japanese armed forces. But their suicidal tactics weren't unique. They were just one of the special attack units. In 1942, the predecessors to the special attack units were present among the ground troops. They were small groups of soldiers who were sent on the most dangerous missions at night to destroy enemy bases using the hit-and-run tactic. But there were other official special forces, including the chiton, a suicide torpedo weapon. One man would sit inside a torpedo and direct it towards an enemy ship, exploding on contact. There were also suicide boats and tiny submarines with similar goals. Now, by the end of the war, the Japanese desperation reached its limit, and the suicide missions increased in intensity. Sometimes, soldiers would put on diving suits and hide near a coast armed with mines attached to bamboo poles to destroy ships above them. They had land-based soldiers that would similarly hide explosives on their bodies and hide in holes to blow up tanks that drove over them. The special attack units were created to cause more destruction, combined with minimal expense of resources, from both a material and human point of view. So they created new transports, designed specifically for this goal. Small suicide boats, designed to sink ships near coasts, were almost completely made out of wood. They were crewed by just one person, and the boat itself used an old Toyota engine to move. Additional space and money went on loading the boats with explosives. Special planes were made for the kamikaze pilots called the Oka. They were small planes with tons of explosives in the nose. They were attached to a larger plane. Most of the parts were made out of wood, not metal, because they didn't need to be durable. They weren't as fast or maneuverable as other standard planes. Not all planes were specifically made for suicide missions. They often used old or retired planes too. They removed all the radio equipment and weaponry and loaded those areas with explosives instead. Now, one myth surrounding kamikaze pilots is that they were unusual fanatics. But the Japanese army simply needed suicide soldiers to fly planes into ships. And honestly, there's a bit of truth in that. The military started recruiting kamikaze pilots from people who passed part of the training. And by 1945, the second half of flight training was completely removed. Now, compared to other tactics, suicide missions demand a comparatively small amount of theoretical knowledge or experience. But the pilots underwent a different, more practical training. They should have known how to deal with non-standard problems like gravity when they were dropped by another plane. It's not a normal situation, and since they rode in on other planes, they had to know how to do that kind of piloting. And even though Japan was in desperate need of soldiers, the imperial government didn't just make people become kamikaze pilots. There was a form so that volunteers had a choice. But was there really a choice at all? Now, it is true that there was a form on the desire to join the army as a kamikaze pilot, and stories gathered by The Guardian and National News from pilots who were training to serve as kamikaze pilots mentioned these facts. The form was a blank piece of paper with 3 choices. I really want to be a kamikaze pilot. I want to join. I don't want to join. Potential recruits were taken into a room and given 5 minutes to decide if they would go voluntarily, refuse, or let their commander decide. But the option to choose became a choice in appearance only later. Most kamikaze pilots were young, 17 or 18 years old, and they wanted to become famous like most teenagers. Volunteering to be a kamikaze pilot guaranteed honor after death and let the youth feel like they were important and created the idea that they were better than their elders in a way. So there was a trend to depict kamikaze pilots as super patriotic and reckless, ready to die without thinking. But the truth is much more tragic. Most of the pilots didn't want to die. A surviving kamikaze pilot, Tahiko Ina, said in an interview with The Guardian that everyone congratulated each other and told him he was chosen for an important mission. But he understood clearly that there was nothing to celebrate and was scared, like many others. Kichi Kuwahara had a similar story. He was just 17 when he realized his fate was decided. He didn't feel any patriotic longing. His thoughts were on his mother and sister, whom he sent money to. Kuwahara wasn't ready to die and leave them alone. Both men were happy they survived. All kamikaze pilots faced an unavoidable fact. They were supposed to die. Some were prepared, others weren't. Some pilots undertook their suicide attacks just to keep friends from having to sacrifice themselves. Their last days and hours were often morose. There were no fancy ceremonies, and the farewell process was personal. Several left locks of hair at holy places. Others got drunk to deaden their nerves. Some were allowed to go home briefly to see their families one last time. On mission day, they spent their last minutes aiming at enemy ships and, per instructions, sending a final Morse code message. A simple, long, uninterrupted signal. The receiving side determined if a mission was successful, if the long signal suddenly stopped. Now the post-war period also wasn't kind to the pilots. The Allies occupied Japan for 7 years after the war ended, and did everything they could to ruin the kamikaze pilots' reputation. They called them crazy fanatics, too reckless to think about themselves. The new Japanese government also promoted this idea, and in the end, Japanese society think about the kamikaze pilots indifferently at best, and sometimes even with disdain. Suddenly, it became hard for pilots to find work or attend school. Also, a stigma appeared for these soldiers called Special Attack Unit Syndrome. This meant these people couldn't return to a normal life because they were possessed by the idea of dying with honor and were incapable of finding a new goal. Unfortunately, these ideas haven't gone anywhere. The youth in Japan still think that they were idiots, and the opinions of these people in other countries like the US is even worse. The word kamikaze is often used as slang for reckless and stupid. They are often compared to terrorists, although the letter usually chose to attack civilian targets, and kamikaze pilots and all the special attack units were only used against military targets. The BBC also notes that the pilots did what they had to do because of the war. They had no choice. During the war, Japanese nationalist propaganda made sure the kamikaze pilots were considered heroes. By 1952, there was a push to remove post-war disdain for kamikaze pilots. From the 1970s onward, the perception shifted, and they once again became heroes. This is still true in Japan today, and the Japanese will always remember the dead pilots with tears in their eyes.